sir, I need you to come with me. You're causing a disruption.
I'm waiting for my nurse. I'm a patient here. I'm paralyzed.
On your feet, now.
I cannot stand. I am paralyzed.
Stop resisting.
I am not resisting. I cannot stand.
What you just watched did not happen in a dark alley. It did not happen on a street corner at night. It did not happen because of a crime. It happened inside a veterans hospital, a building constructed specifically for the men and women who gave this country everything they had. A place where paralyzed veterans come to receive care, to see their doctors, to be treated with the dignity their service earned them. And it happened to Paul Carlton, a 71-year-old Army veteran, a father of 3. A man who lost the use of his legs at 43 years old during a training accident at Fort Decatur, Georgia, an injury that the Army itself documented, reviewed, and compensated him for. A man who had been coming to Briarwood Veterans Medical Center every single month for the past 28 years without incident. Paul Carlton had been a patient at that hospital longer than the man who handcuffed him had been alive, and on a Tuesday morning in September, inside a corridor he had wheeled himself through hundreds of times, Paul Carlton was grabbed by the arm, dragged from his wheelchair, and handcuffed on the floor of a VA hospital for the crime of sitting in a wheelchair and waiting for his nurse. His VA wristband was on his wrist. His medical records were in his wheelchair pouch. His appointment was 10 feet away. None of it mattered to James Wedel. This is what happened. All of it. And this is what it cost. Before we go any further, if you believe a paralyzed veteran sitting in a VA hospital waiting room deserves to be treated like a patient and not a criminal, type the word justice in the comments right now. Just that one word. Because Paul Carlton spent 28 years coming to that hospital. He deserved better than what happened to him on that Tuesday morning. And the more people who comment, the more people this story reaches, and the more people who know this happened. Paul Carlton woke up at 6:15 that morning the same way he woke up most mornings. Slowly, deliberately, and without any help. That last part mattered to him more than most people understood. His daughter Renee had offered to move in with him after he turned 70. His son Marcus, who practiced civil rights law in Phoenix, had mentioned one of those assisted living facilities, the nice ones with the shuttle buses and the activity rooms. Paul had smiled at both of them and said no to both. He had been managing his own life from a wheelchair for 28 years. He had learned to cook, to drive a modified van, to navigate airports and grocery stores and doctors' offices and every other space that wasn't always designed with him in mind. He had raised 2 of his 3 children largely from that chair after his wife Donna passed in 2009. He was not a man who needed someone to manage his life for him. That September morning, he made himself coffee, ate toast with peanut butter, and checked his phone for messages. His appointment at Briarwood was at 9:30 with Dr. Amara Osi, his spinal care physician of 11 years. It was a routine monthly checkup, blood pressure, medication review, a brief assessment of mobility and pain levels. The kind of appointment that had become as unremarkable to Paul as brushing his teeth. He loaded his wheelchair into his modified van at 8:40, drove the 22 minutes to Briarwood Veterans Medical Center, pulled into the accessible parking bay closest to the east entrance, the same bay he had used for years, and wheeled himself inside through the automatic doors. The receptionist at the front desk was a woman named Gloria. She had worked that desk for 9 years and knew Paul Carlton by name, by appointment schedule, and by the fact that he always parked in Bay 4 and always arrived early. She looked up when he came through the doors and told him Dr. Osi was running a few minutes behind. Window the way he always did. He liked the window the way he always did. He liked the light. He pulled out his phone, opened a news app, and settled in to wait. He was wearing his coral red polo shirt. He had a VA-issued patient wristband on his left wrist from check-in. His wheelchair had a custom side pouch containing his medical folder, his insurance cards, and his VA identification card. There was nothing ambiguous about what Paul Carlton was, or why he was there. He was a patient, in a waiting area, at his own hospital, waiting for his own doctor. James Wedel would spend the next several minutes pretending none of that was visible. James Wedel was 29 years old and had been a contracted security officer at Briarwood Veterans Medical Center for 14 months. He was not a city police officer. He did not carry a gun. He was employed by a private company called Sentinel Guard Solutions, which had a contract with the hospital to provide on-site security. But Wedel carried himself like a man with more authority than his contract described. His colleagues had noticed it. His supervisor, a man named Mark Salazar, had noted it twice in Wedel's performance reviews. The language careful and HR approved, but the concern was there. Good instincts, the reviews said, but a tendency to escalate situations before attempting to de-escalate them. Salazar had flagged it as something to monitor going forward. He had not monitored it loudly enough. That morning, Wedel received a call from a hospital administrator. A visitor somewhere in the building had called in a complaint about a man in a wheelchair in the East Wing corridor who was, according to the complaint, acting strangely and refusing to move when asked. The complaint was vague, and the administrator who relayed it to Wedel did not ask any follow-up questions about who the man was or whether he was a patient. Wedel did not ask any either. He walked toward the East Wing. The hospital's own written protocol for security interactions in patient areas required officers to approach individuals with the assumption that they were patients first, to identify themselves clearly, to ask whether the individual needed assistance, and to gather basic identifying information before taking any physical action. The protocol existed because Briarwood was a medical facility serving people with serious physical injuries, many of whom had limited mobility, hearing impairments, or conditions that could cause them to appear confused or unresponsive to someone who didn't know better. Wedel had been trained on that protocol. He had signed off on it during his onboarding 14 months earlier. He didn't follow a single step of it when he reached the East Wing corridor and saw Paul Carlton sitting in his wheelchair near the window in a coral red polo shirt with a VA wristband on his wrist and a medical folder in the pouch of his chair. Instead, Wedel stopped in front of the wheelchair and told Paul he needed to move along because he had been reported for loitering. Paul told him he was a patient waiting for an appointment. He pointed to the examination room door 10 feet away. Wedel told him again to move to the main lobby. Paul told him he had been coming to this hospital for 28 years, and his appointment was right there. Wedel told him to get on his feet. Paul told him he was paralyzed and could not stand. Wedel told him he was going to need to come with him. Paul told him again, clearly, calmly, for the third time, that he was paralyzed from the waist down and was physically unable to stand up. A registered nurse named Mario Leonard stepped out of a nearby room at that moment. She had worked the East Wing for 3 years and had seen Paul Carlton at his monthly appointments for most of that time. She recognized him immediately. She told Wedel directly that this was Paul Carlton, that he was a patient, that he had an appointment, and that she knew him personally. Wedel told her to step back. Mario stepped back, and she pulled out her phone. Wedel turned back to Paul and told him, his voice lower now, that he was going to need him to come with him. Paul told him he was not going anywhere. His nurse was standing right there. His doctor was in that room. His appointment had started 2 minutes ago. Wedel reached down and grabbed Paul Carlton's arm. What happened next was recorded on Mario Leonard's phone, on 3 corridor security cameras, and witnessed by at least 4 other people in that hallway. Wedel pulled. Paul's upper body came forward. His legs did not move, because they could not move, because they had not moved in 28 years. The wheelchair rolled backward from the force. Paul grabbed the armrest with his free hand to stop himself from going over completely. Wedel pulled again. This time the chair tipped. Paul Carlton hit the corridor floor, his shoulder absorbing the impact, his legs folding beneath him at angles that would have been agonizing if he had any feeling below his waist. Saw the medical folder from his wheelchair pouch scattered across the linoleum, his VA identification card, his insurance documents, his monthly appointment records. All of it spread out across the floor around him while he lay there, breathing hard. A 71-year-old paralyzed Army veteran who had done nothing except sit in a hospital waiting room and tell the truth about his own body. Wedel handcuffed him on the floor. He cited Paul Carlton for disorderly conduct and failure to comply with a security directive. 2 other patients at the edge of the hallway stood watching. Neither of them spoke. They didn't know what to say. Mario Leonard was still recording. Her hands were shaking. Paul looked up at her from the floor. He asked her to call Dr. Osei. Mario was already dialing. Dr. Amara Osei had been Paul Carlton's physician for 11 years. She had reviewed his complete medical file more times than she could count. She had documented his T6 spinal cord injury in precise clinical language, complete paralysis below the mid-chest, permanent, irreversible, the result of a 1996 military training accident. She had signed off on his VA disability classification every year for a decade. She knew Paul Carlton's medical history as well as she knew her own. When Mario called and said that someone was arresting Mr. Carlton in the hallway, Dr. Osei did not ask for clarification. She moved. She came around the corner and took in the entire scene at once. Paul on the floor, the handcuffs, the scattered documents, Wedel standing over him. She did not raise her voice. She had learned over 22 years of medicine that the most effective version of herself was the quiet, certain one. She told Wedel to remove the handcuffs. When he hesitated, she told him that the man on the floor was her patient of 11 years, that he had a complete T6 spinal cord injury and was physically incapable of standing, and that if Wedel did not remove the handcuffs within the next 10 seconds, she would be calling the hospital director, the VA patient advocate office, and the police. Wedel looked at Paul. He looked at the VA documents spread across the floor around him. He looked at Mario, still recording. He looked at the other patients who had gathered at the edge of the hallway. He removed the handcuffs. The medical evaluation that followed documented 3 findings. A grade 2 shoulder sprain from the impact of the fall, deep contusion bruising on both wrists from the handcuffs, and what Dr. Osi described in her clinical notes as significant emotional and psychological distress consistent with acute trauma. She chose that language carefully. She knew exactly where those notes were going to end up. Paul sat in the examination room while she worked and said very little. He had spent 28 years learning to navigate a world that wasn't always built for him. And somewhere in those years, he had also learned when to save his words. He was saving them. Mario sat near the door. She had already sent the recording to herself at 3 different email addresses and to her personal cloud storage. She had also taken note of every corridor camera position she could see from where she had been standing, because she knew those cameras had captured the entire thing. When Dr. Iose finished the evaluation, she sat across from Paul and told him directly. What happened to him that morning was not a misunderstanding. It was a failure at every level. By Wedel, by whoever passed on the vague complaint without verifying it, and by the hospital administration that had contracted a security service with inadequate protocols and insufficient oversight. Paul had every right to pursue every legal option available to him. Paul looked at her and said he knew. She told him she would have her documentation in his file before the end of the day. Every detail, written exactly as it happened. He called her by her first name for the first time in 11 years. She didn't correct it. Paul Carlton sat in his van for a long time before he started the engine. He thought about the first time he had come to Briarwood back in 1996, freshly discharged, learning what his life was going to look like from a wheelchair. He thought about Donna, who had held his hand through the early appointments when everything still felt impossible. He thought about his daughter Renee, who was going to hear about this and be devastated. He thought about the other veterans who came through those hospital doors every day, some younger than him, some in worse shape, some without a son who happened to practice civil rights law in Phoenix. Or he thought about his VA identification card lying on the corridor floor next to his scattered medical records, while a 29-year-old security guard stood over him with handcuffs. Then, he picked up his phone and called Marcus. Marcus Carlton had practiced civil rights law for 12 years. He let his father finish speaking without interrupting. When Paul was done, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do not sign anything. You do not speak to anyone from the hospital or the security company without him present. And do not move from the parking lot because he was on his way." Paul looked through the windshield at the American flag above the hospital entrance, moving slowly in the desert wind. He told Marcus he wasn't going anywhere. Paul Carlton's VA card was on that floor. His wristband was on his wrist. His nurse recognized him by name. His doctor was 10 feet away. And none of it was enough to stop what happened. If this is making you angry, that anger is exactly right. Share this video, because every person who watches this story is one more person demanding better. That is how accountability works. Keep watching, because what came next changed everything for Paul Carlton, for James Wedel, and for every veteran who walks through those doors. Mark Salazar got the call from Patricia Vance, the Briarwood Hospital director, at 11:14 that morning, 41 minutes after Wedel had handcuffed Paul Carlton on the corridor floor. Salazar had supervised Wedel for 14 months. He had written the 2 performance reviews that flagged Wedel's escalation tendency. He had meant to follow up more forcefully. He had not done it. Patricia Vance told him that one of his officers had dragged a paralyzed 71-year-old veteran out of his wheelchair inside a VA hospital, and that the incident had been recorded on a nurse's phone and on 3 separate corridor security cameras, and that the VA Patient Advocate Office had already been notified. Salazar asked one question. He asked whether the veteran had been treated. Vance said yes. He asked whether a formal complaint was being made. Vance looked at him over her glasses and said that a 71-year-old paralyzed Army veteran had been handcuffed on the floor of a veterans hospital that morning. RN asked him what he thought. Wedel was suspended before noon. Marcus Carlton arrived at the Briarwood parking lot less than an hour after Paul called him. He sat with his father in the van, reviewed the situation, and then spent the remainder of the afternoon moving fast. Within 72 hours, he had secured Mario Leonard's full recording, issued a formal legal preservation request for all corridor security camera footage from that morning, and obtained Dr. Iosi's complete written documentation of Paul's injuries, medical history, and clinical assessment of what had occurred. He also submitted a formal complaint to the VA Office of Inspector General, citing violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and VA Patient Rights Policy. He filed a notice of intent to sue against 3 parties: Sentinel Guard Solutions, Briarwood Veterans Medical Center, and James Wedel individually. The hospital's legal team watched the corridor camera footage, then watched it again. A third attorney reviewed it separately and said nothing for a long moment after it finished. The footage was definitive. It showed Paul Carlton sitting calmly in a waiting area with his VA wristband visible and his medical documents in the wheelchair pouch. It showed Wedel approaching without any identification check, without consulting the patient registration system, without asking a single clarifying question. It showed Paul stating 3 times that he was paralyzed. It showed Mario Leonard identifying Paul personally and being waved off. It showed Wedel grabbing Paul's arm despite everything he had been told. It showed Paul hitting the floor. It showed Paul's documents scattering across the linoleum. It showed Wedel handcuffing a 71-year-old paralyzed veteran on the floor of a VA hospital while his own medical records lay spread around him. The lead attorney called Patricia Vance after reviewing it. He told her they could not take this to trial. She already knew. The formal investigation into James Wedel's conduct lasted 3 weeks. Investigators found that he had violated the hospital's mandatory patient interaction protocol at every step. He had ignored 3 direct verbal statements of medical disability from Paul Carlton. He had dismissed a registered nurse's identification of a known patient. He had proceeded to physical intervention without conducting any verification check whatsoever against the hospital's patient registration system. And he had done all of this in response to a complaint that, when investigators traced it back to its source, turned out to be nothing more than a hospital visitor who had seen Paul sitting quietly near a window and decided that a black man in a wheelchair sitting alone looked confused. That was the complaint. An unverified observation from a visitor who did not know Paul, did not work at the hospital, and had never spoken to him, passed on without any follow-up, acted on without a single question. James Wedel was terminated by Sentinel Guard Solutions. His security license in the state of Arizona was suspended pending a state review board hearing. The review board considered the circumstances, the termination, the federal complaint, and the documented failure to follow protocol in a VA facility, and concluded that the license would be permanently revoked. James Wedel, 29 years old, could no longer work as a licensed security officer in Arizona. When you searched his name, the incident report was the first result. It still is. The federal civil rights lawsuit was filed 8 weeks after the incident. It alleged violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, unlawful detention, assault and battery, failure to train, a failure to supervise, and deliberate indifference to Paul Carlton's civil rights and medical needs as a veteran patient. The defendants were Sentinel Guard Solutions and Briarwood Veterans Medical Center. Both legal teams reviewed the same evidence: the camera footage, Mario Leonard's recording, Dr. Osei's clinical documentation, 6 witness statements from people who had been in or near that corridor, the written VA protocol that Wedel had signed during onboarding and ignored entirely. Both legal teams arrived at the same conclusion independently. No jury in the country was going to side with a security guard who had dragged a paralyzed 71-year-old Army veteran out of his wheelchair on the floor of a VA hospital in front of multiple cameras, while the man's own medical records lay scattered around him. The settlement was reached 7 months after the incident, $8 million, paid jointly by Sentinel Guard Solutions and the hospital's liability insurer. Or it was at the time one of the largest disability rights settlements involving a veterans medical facility in the country. Paul Carlton signed the documents on a Wednesday morning. Marcus drove him to the office. Paul reviewed every page, asked 3 questions, all of them specific, all of them sharp, and then signed. Afterward, Marcus asked him how he felt. Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said he wanted to go home, call Renee, and figure out how to make sure none of this happened to the next person. That was Paul Carlton. That had always been Paul Carlton. Paul Carlton still goes to Briarwood Veterans Medical Center every month. He still parks in Bay 4. He still waves to Gloria at the front desk. He still wheels himself down the East Wing corridor and sits near the window in the same waiting area where it all happened. Because he refuses to let one man's failure to see him rewrite how he moves through a space that was built for him. The hospital implemented mandatory disability awareness and patient identification training for all contracted security personnel within 6 months of the settlement. A new protocol was established requiring security officers to cross-check the patient registration system before initiating any physical interaction with an individual in a medical area. Informally, nor out to bring Paul back for his appointment. They exchange a look that doesn't need any words behind it. Dr. Osei still signs off on Paul's annual disability classification. Her notes still say the same thing they have always said: complete T6 spinal cord injury, permanent, irreversible. James Wedel has not worked in licensed security since his termination. He appealed the license revocation once. It was denied. and Paul Carlton used a portion of the $8 million to establish a fund through the Tucson Veterans Support Coalition. The fund provides free legal consultation to disabled veterans in Arizona who have experienced discrimination or civil rights violations, who have been ignored when they told the truth about their own bodies, who found themselves without a Marcus Carlton to call from a parking lot. He named the fund the Donna Carlton Access Fund, after his wife, the woman who had sat beside him through more of those appointments than either of them had ever counted. Paul Carlton didn't want revenge. He wanted accountability. And then he took that accountability and built something with it that could protect the next person, and the one after that. That is what justice looks like when it actually works. If this story stayed with you, share it. Not just because the algorithm needs engagement to keep pushing it out, though it does. Share it because somewhere right now, there is another veteran in another waiting room, and the person walking toward them needs to be better prepared than James Wedel was. Subscribe to stay with stories like this one. Real people, real injustice. And what happens when someone decides not to let it go quietly? Paul Carlton didn't.